Hey everybody, this is Brian Coley, the Movie Whisperer, and this is a place where we look at the intersection of our movies with our story. And today I'm excited to do another video on an Oscar nominee and why you should see it. And this movie is Minari. Now, I brought on a friend of mine, Paul Lim. Now, Paul is a good friend of mine from church, and we actually watched the film together as couples. Not he and I as a couple, but our spouses, and very social distance, right, Paul? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we watched it, and I was just fascinated because I was thinking, I just want to pick his brain as to how this film landed on him as a Korean American and so forth. And of course, I want to disclaim from the very get-go that I'm always scared to say, here's one Korean American and he represents all of the Korean American community, which we know that's not true. And so no tokenism here. But Paul, I'm just excited to talk to you about this movie and talk about it from the intersection of your story, but also see if you can help me as far as figuring out what this story might mean as far as our cultural narrative, like where we might be headed and how this foreshadows it. Because you're a smart man and love movies. So first of all, I guess the first question is, how did it feel as a person who's Asian, but specifically Korean American, to see yourself on the screen and to see a film like this? Tell me that experience first.
Yeah, no, I think it was really cool to see Korean Americans represented on the big screen, and not just represented, but really spotlighted and featured in the movie. And I think back to my the first movie in my lifetime that I recall where it was really just an all Asian cast and it was about Asian Americans was the Joy Luck Club. If you remember that movie from back in the day.
Totally.
And I'm not Chinese American, but I celebrated it because we don't often get our stories spotlighted on the big screen like that. And I think about more recently sitting down to watch Crazy Rich Asians with my wife, who is German Irish, and her parents. And it was interesting to watch the movie and also sort of out of the corner of my eyes, like check out their reactions and did they laugh at the same parts that I laughed at, or get to see that. But seeing Minari was a really big deal for me because I think about how in America, like Hispanics are sort of all lumped together into one giant glob. In much the same way that Asian Americans were all lumped together in one giant glob, and not understanding and not realizing that outside of the United States, I mean, Asia is such a separated kind of continent with countries and factions. And so, Crazy Rich Asians was all about Singapore, right? And then Joy Luck Club was all about the Chinese American experience. It was really nice to see the Korean American experience spotlighted on the big screen. So
yeah, and this is two years in a row, right? Because last year Parasite won, and it was a Korean film. I don't know what that says exactly, that we've got it back to back. It's kind of exciting to me to see that be honored at the Oscars. We can kind of go into, talking about why you think those movies now. But before we get into that, I know that when we were watching it, I was just so curious as to how it was landing on you. You were laughing at the places that I was thinking, there must have been something personal. Tell everybody, let's start off with tell everybody what the story of the movie is first,
sure.
And what the plot of it is for those people who haven't seen it. And then we'll come back and talk about how those plot things may intersect your story.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a drama written and directed by Lee Isaac Chung, and it's based, I don't know how loosely or how tightly it's based on his own experience,
Yeah, it's pretty tight,
coming to
actually.
America,
Yeah.
right? So he is a second generation Korean American. His parents came directly from Korea over to the States. But in the movie, the story is about this family settling down in rural Arkansas, and just trying to get connected and trying to survive and trying to really fulfill that American dream. And just the sort of little quirks along the way that they run into. Some of them are little quirks, some of them are big. But it's the stranger in a strange land
Hmm.
kind of story,
That's
right?
good.
But it's a very real one and uniquely American, I think.
That's interesting that you say that, because
Uh,
in screenwriting terms, we call that fish out of water tales. And I would have never pegged this movie for
mhm.
a fish out of water. Do you think that because, your story kind of mirrors that first generation immigrant kind of story, at least your parents, that that fish out of water kind of just magnifies itself even more, so that it's not the traditional kind of fish out of water, but it is from the standpoint of being a Korean coming to America. So tell folks your story, and then maybe we can talk through some of the intersections.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my parents are both from South Korea, born and raised there. And let's see, they left a very unstable, from a political perspective, they left an unstable South Korea, moved to Malaysia for a little bit right after they got married. That's where my brother and I were born. So they were working for the Korean embassy in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
Oh,
And then when I was about 5, they started the process of, moving to the States. So, the whole green card thing and all that stuff. On the way to the States, we stopped in Korea for a little bit just to get, all the paperwork and all that sort of stuff in order. I think at least that's what they told me. I don't remember any of this. I was 5.
right.
Um, then we moved to the States in 1979 in January. It's when we landed at JFK in New York. And we lived with my mother's sister, one of my mother's sisters, there in Bloomfield, New Jersey for a little while,
Wow.
and then moved down to Fairfax, Virginia, where I was pretty much raised and where my parents are today. So,
Wow. And what did your parents? What do
yep.
your parents do? They're not
Oh,
farmers, are they?
well, no, they are not farmers. They did not do any chicken sexing at all,
Yeah. Yeah.
as it's depicted in the movie. They were, like a lot of Asian Americans, they were small business owners.
Hmm.
So they started out, when they first moved here. I think my dad worked for 7-Eleven. I think my mom worked at a department store, and then they saved enough money to buy their own small business. It was a little lobby shop, the ground floor of an office building in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
So they worked their tails off, and they grew. They got a couple of them, and then they owned a Hallmark store for a while. But you know, typical small business owner type of deal. So
Yeah. So
16-hour days, the whole nine.
so as you're watching the film, like, this is total different. It's rural. It's a guy with a dream of doing a farm and planting Korean fruit, and again being able to sell
Right,
it as a small businessman. But he's trying to not do the chicken sex thing, which is like no brand, like just
right,
almost feel like factory worker kind of uh,
right.
jobs. Like, when you saw that, was there any intersection in your mind and it sounds like you were almost the same age as the little boy, David, in the film, which is who Lee Isaac Chung, the director, is supposed to
Yeah.
be in the film. It sounds like you kind of share that time period of when it's shot, as well as when he's at that age. So first question is, was there any sense in which this was the American dream for your parents and it was like getting the farm, or was it more like the chicken sexing where it was like, well, this is how we have to work hard to just do what we have to do here in America, you know?
So I think, and I don't want to read too much into the movie, but I will speak from my experience and from what I've come to understand about where my parents were in terms of their mindset and their approach. Um, the For my parents, it was a couple of things. My mother's entire family, so her brothers and sisters, were all over here in the States. Mm. So had my parents stayed in Korea, right, it would have been very difficult for my mother to see her family. My father, because he is who he is, decided, let's go ahead and move to the States, because then, my mother could be closer to her family. Meanwhile, his family was all in Korea. So he left his family behind, right?
Wow.
But that's one of the reasons and one of the motivations for my parents to have made the move. But the second one is for my brother and I. So the American dream was not for them. They weren't coming here so that they could get the American dream. They would have liked a little bit of it if things had worked out a certain way, but primarily they came over for my brother and I so that we could have the American dream, not so much that they did. And for much of their lives, it was backbreaking, mind-numbing work, right? And so I think that's kind of where I feel like Stephen Young's character and his wife, that's really why they're here. At least that's why I think he's there, right? There's a little bit of that American dream that he wants, but mostly it's for the children.
So, Paul, tell me, I know we were watching this film and there was a lot of little giggles over there in, in the corner. I could tell that there was moments that were connected to your experience. So tell me some of those moments and, that connected with you deeply as far as being Korean American.
Yeah, no, there's plenty to choose from, Brian. And I think one of the first things in the movie, one of the first scenes in the movie was brought one to mind. And it was the idea that you take off your shoes before you enter the house. And I think back to sleepovers that I went to as a kid, going over to a non-Asian friend's house. And as soon as I got inside the door, my shoes were off, and they would look at me funny, like, what are you doing taking your shoes off here? Like, why are you doing that?
Right.
And I think also about the Chinese herbal medicine, right, that the grandmother brings from Korea, and the little boy's face every time he drinks it every night. That's a taste and a smell that I remember very well, vividly, because my grandmother and my mother used to make me do that at least once a year. It was horrible. Like, I have no idea what's in that, but it is probably not good for you. The other thing that I was thinking about in the movie, and this, I had a really special relationship with my grandmother. This is my maternal grandmother, who was in the States, and she was her husband passed away when my mom's younger brother was only 3 or 4.
Wow.
So essentially, my grandmother was a single mother raising 5 children during the Korean War.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So I love and respect my grandmother. All of us grandkids do. We called her Yoda because she was about 4 foot nothing, but she would still kick our behinds, right?
Yeah.
She would still put us in our place. But I think about my grandmother because she's very, very similar to the grandmother in the movie. She was always planting things. She had a garden at every one of her children's houses. So at my parents' house, she had a garden. at my aunts and uncles' houses. She had a garden there. So she would just kind of do the rotation, right? Spend a couple of nights at each of the kids' houses and tend to the garden while she was there. Um, and I remember vividly, and I don't know if this is sharing too much, but my
Nobody's watching, so you know.
that's cool. She when I got old enough to drive, she would call me if she couldn't get a hold of anybody else because she wanted me to give her a lift somewhere. She never drove, right? Never learned how.
Yeah.
But she would. I remember one day she called me and said, "I need to come over to your house because we're going to go across the street to go pick chestnuts." And I was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about, girl. We don't have a chestnut tree in our neighborhood." Come to find out that what she meant was my parents lived right across the street from George Mason University. And somehow she learned that on campus at one of I think it was a professor's residence, there was a gigantic old chestnut tree there. And she wanted me to go with her to go pick chestnuts from this private property.
So you had no problem with trespassing, though.
I mean, it wasn't trespassing to her. There were chestnuts. They were on the ground. She was just going to pick them up.
Yes,
right.
Of course.
So I'm like scoping out the residence, making sure nobody's there. Meanwhile, my grandmother.
So
just
you're
went
the lookout, basically. Is what you're saying.
Yeah.
You're the lookout.
Right. Keep the engine running. Keep my eyes peeled. That was my job. But I that lots of those kinds of memories just came boiling back up in me watching the movie. So it was a lot of fun to watch.
That's so good. I know David, the little boy in the film, says, "You're not like a grandmother," you know,
right?
And telling him that she watches wrestling and plays all these card games, and I think he says something like, "You wear men's underwear." I don't know what he said, something like that, you know. And so it sounds like your grandmother was not like the average.
In
grandma.
Some ways. Yeah, no, definitely not the average grandmother, but in some ways she was very much like the grandmother in the movie. So
good. So good. The Minari. So, you know, the main character is working so hard at growing this garden and trying to bring out of the soil that he's trying to figure out how to do water. He's trying to do not just vegetables, but Korean vegetables, and then be able to sell those. And the grandmother's just over there like planting this plant that I'd never heard of until now.
Right.
And so tell me about, do you have any memory of that plant or any kind of connection with, you know, what that meant and how that meant as far as the story? Because it seems tremendously emblematic, obviously, because it's the title of the movie, and because it was something that just kind of grew while the dad is toiling. So what did you make of that metaphor, and is there any sort of real world experience with the plant itself?
Well, I'll answer the second part of that question first. I have not that I'm aware of have any direct interaction with that plant. I don't think it's one that if my parents presented it on the table and asked me to eat it, I probably would have tried it and said, nope, not a fan.
Right.
I will tell you, in my parents' garden, the one that my grandmother tended until she passed away, there are lots of things that I won't eat. And in Korean history, during the Korean War, there wasn't a whole lot of meat available to them. There wasn't even a whole lot of fresh vegetables. So they had to make do with some of the things like the minari, things that grew in the wild, untended. And that's what they used. That's what they used to survive, right? They ate those kinds of things. So I always joke that, do you remember that old show Fear Factor?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's always one part of the show where they have to eat something funky,
Yeah.
right? The contestants have to eat something weird. I was like, Asian would pass that test with flying colors. There'd be no squirming, no hesitation. They're like, oh yeah, that's like. And I'm talking about, when I say Asian, I'm not talking about Asian American. I'm talking like a real Asian. They eat funky stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So no direct experience with that, but I'm sure my grandmother's familiar with it. I'm sure that my mother is familiar with it. But in terms of the if you want to think about that as a metaphor, and you kind of run in parallel the Stephen Young's character and his plan for growing things in America, and then the grandmother's approach to growing things in America. It's really interesting to think about those, and I don't know that I've really given much thought up until just now, but I never really saw them in parallel. I mean, I only saw the movie once with you, and so
Yeah.
for me, it takes a couple, 2, 3 viewings to really start to dig into to the to to the deep stuff.
Yeah.
But there's definitely some there's definitely a message there that I think the director and writer is really trying to convey. Um, and I'm not entirely sure what that message is yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to try to speculate and come up with something, but I really think there's something that's definitely worth exploring, though.
Yeah. It seems to me that I was watching an interview with Stephen Young, and he was talking about this issue of him being a Korean American actor
Mm,
playing this role and kind of representing, right?
mm,
And yet he also had to go to Korea and show the film. And he kept talking about, like, there was always this eye on him of how he should be, whether it's in
mm,
Korea, like, is he too American, or is he proud of being American? Is he not Korean enough? And then he's in America. Is he pleasing the Korean American community? Is he
mm,
pleasing the American, like, is he embracing his ethnicity? And
right.
I just found that really interesting, that there was always this kind of tension of that watchful eye of uh, communities that he felt he was torn between. And I can imagine that that goes for any immigrant, any person of color. um, I guess my question to you is, what has that tension look like in your life? How does
Mm,
that play itself out? Um, let's start there, and then I want to ask a little bit about just the concept of, that American dream and assimilation kind of concept. But let's just start with the question of, like, that tension of, the world of, am I American? Am I Korean enough? Am I, this enough? So
it's interesting that you bring that up, Brian, because I mentioned earlier that since I came to the States, I have not been back
mm,
to Korea, not even to visit. I remember when my father's parents um, passed away, it was only my father who went back.
mm,
Right? It wasn't the whole family. It was just my father who went back for the funeral. So I have never been back. My brother's been back a couple times. But what I've heard about Korean Americans who grown up here in the States, going back to Korea, it's very easy to spot a Korean who's grown up in America versus a Korean who's grown up in Korea. And I'm not sure exactly what those signs are.
mhm.
And I don't know that there's really any truth to that, because I have not been, so I haven't experienced it for myself. But that's what I hear, is that if you're a Korean American and you go back to Korea, they know that you're not from here.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to me that the Koreans, for lack of a better word, can be racist against themselves,
Hmm.
against other Koreans.
Mhm.
And it's not a racial thing, but it's a cultural thing,
Mhm.
right? So, for those who grew up in Korea and live in Korea, there is no hyphenation,
Mhm.
right? There's no duality. They're just straight up, I'm Korean,
Mhm.
right? Whereas here, for me, I am, I'm, I'm not a native in my native land,
Mhm.
right? And I'm not a native in my adopted land either.
Mhm.
At least not according to a lot of people. But I am definitely more American, I think, than I am Korean.
Mhm.
But I definitely get like, but what do they say? It's like, I feel like a ship without a port.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's sometimes it's worse than others, but sometimes I feel that a lot. But
Mhm.
most of the days I just go about my business. But when I stop and think about it, that does hit home. That
Yeah.
I don't have a port to call home. So.
Yeah. It hit me in the film so strongly whenever William Patton comes, who's one of the characters who's
Hmm.
helping him, grow his garden at the very beginning, and he says, I'm raising, like Korean vegetables.
Right.
Um, and so it kind of, the first part of the film, you're like, oh, he's trying to do the American dream of the farm, and it's just sort of this nostalgia of, America and farm life, and the earth, and
Hmm.
owning a piece of land, and making something out of it. And yet at the same time, he's trying to hold on to a sense of his his ethnicity too, with the growing
Right.
Korean vegetables, which may, again, we may even through this conversation be able to figure out what the Minari is from the standpoint of just what it is at the end of the
Right.
film. But it struck me in that place that there is no sense of him kind of leaving behind a sense of himself, even though he's trying to go after this American dream.
Hmm.
Um, I wanted to ask that concept of, I find a lot of times in conversations with, let's say, African Americans, that the idea of assimilation is not in the conversation. you know,
Hmm.
the idea of, even the idea of just colorblindness is no longer something that's a goal of any kind. It's making sure that you see my identity as well as you see my humanity.
Right.
And I feel like the idea of that from an Asian perspective might be different from the standpoint of being more about assimilation. Is that fair to say? Is it more the American dream than it is the Korean vegetable, or is there a sense in which it's almost like trying to find that way of having both? Like, how has that played out in your life, and how do you feel like in what you've observed that plays itself out specifically with Asian Americans?
Uh, I don't know what it's like for anyone else, but I can speak to what
Yeah.
it's like for me. Obviously, it's interesting. I mean, we've had some conversations outside of this. Apologies for that. But the my parents, when we came to the States, um, my mother's English was okay because she studied English literature in college in Korea.
Wow.
So she had, a basic understanding of the language. My father, not so much. So when we came to the States, especially when we were in elementary school, my parents told my brother and I to speak English at home,
Hmm.
not Korean,
Mm-hmm.
because they knew that there was that they had to learn the language. They
Mm-hmm.
had to figure it out, and they had to get good at it if they wanted to, partake, right? Um, so that's always struck me, and it's always stuck with me, is that they wanted my brother and I to speak English at home. So what we learned in school, we brought it home. We talked about whatever subject, whatever we talked about, we had to talk about it in English. Um, and there's a little bit of now that I am where I am at this age, having the benefit of the years in hindsight, I feel a little sad about that, that one particular fact, because I would love to be fluent and completely 100% bilingual. But that's not something that happened, right? Because when I was at school, I spoke English. When I came home, I had to speak English because that's what my parents wanted. So, yeah, that's always that now, right now, that makes me a little sad thinking back on that, because it in a way it robbed me of that part of who I am.
Yeah.
And having gone to college as a literature major, and in grad school as a creative writing person, language, whether written or spoken, is tremendously important to me. And the fact that I don't have that language to express myself in, it bothers me a little.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, and I think my parents realized that a little bit later, because in high school, in middle school and high school, they tried to drag my brother and I to what they call Korean school. It was run at our church, and my mother was one of the teachers or instructors there. So it was on a Saturday. So not only did we go to school Monday through Friday, but now my mom is now dragging me to school on Saturday.
Oh no.
It's done at the church building where we went to church on Sunday. So I was at church. My weekend was shot. Right. So,
right.
So I was like, obviously as a teenager, I was like, nope, I'm not having this. I'm going to just resist this as best as I can. But looking back again, it's an opportunity that I squandered to not really wrap my head around that and learn that language as best as I can.
Yeah.
And so that's I take that for what it is, but when I think about assimilation, I think about those two pieces of my life is my parents and their insistence when I was really young on speaking English, and then them trying to drag me to Korean school later on in life. I was like,
yeah.
So,
and that might be part of, I don't know, what do you think of this? Just to pitch it out of the top of my head, that might be part of the metaphor with the Minari, is that, it seems to me that you were caught in a world where your parents were working hard to teach you how to have a garden that was American vegetables, and then they went, oh, no, let's make sure he's got some Korean vegetables and stuff like that. And then yet the Minari is just sort of this thing that just is, right? That just kind of grows on it. I always think of it. The only comparison I have as a white Southerner is kudzu, which never produces anything that's valuable, but
just more kudzu.
There's more kudzu, but
right.
That was the way I felt like it was kind of growing on its own, and maybe that has something to do or maybe that's a question. Do you think that maybe has something to do with the idea of what it would be like just to kind of organically be who you are and not have to strive between the Korean and the American and all that kind of stuff? Does that sound freeing to you?
It's interesting, and I'm cool if we just rap about this for the next hour. But if I think about so in the movie, the way that the grandmother just found a spot, right, the spot in the woods to plant the Minari, and they walked all day, right? Her and David walked all day to find the perfect spot for this. So and once she planted it, it just kind of took over, right? It did its own thing, untended, and sort of melded into the landscape. So an argument could be made that that is one approach to assimilation,
Mm.
right? And I don't know if it's better or worse than the Stephen Young's character's version of assimilation, but it's just kind of blending in and not being noticed, right? It kind of camouflages itself in the scenery, and in a lot of ways, that was what we were told to do,
Mm.
we were encouraged to do, and we sort of almost some of us did it naturally, just as a
Mm.
course of survival, right here in the country. Whereas the Stephen Young's character is like his deliberate growing and marketing and selling of Korean vegetables is, I think, almost a less assimilationist, if
Mm.
you will.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Right? It's about here is my culture, here is what I value, right? I want you to value it too.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah.
Um, so in a way, and we could go on and on, because then why is the movie called Minari, right? Because
Right.
if that was really the more valuable lesson to learn, then why wasn't it called you know Korean Vegetable Farm?
Korean vegetable.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. Well, Parasite won last year, and
Hmm.
it was really a huge year in which the Oscar nominees were saying the theme that I pulled out last year was, will we be our brother's keeper?
Hmm.
And will we test our devotion to see if we'll be our brother's uh, keeper? And that played itself out incredibly in 2020 with the pandemic and with race and
Hmm.
with a lot of things. And Parasite played in perfectly as far as almost a cautionary tale, because it was like, dog eat dog kind of thing, where it
Yeah.
was all about classism and all about opportunistic, like this is what it looks like to not be your brother's keeper, right?
Right.
And so I felt like it was a great icon of, this is, this plays into this theme, but this is, what not to do in the middle of a pandemic.
Hmm.
And ironically enough, it was about choosing between people and economy. It was choosing people and
Yeah.
money. And that's what we ended up having to choose between, is people and money in 2020. Um, I've been really struggling with Minari, thinking, what is it saying about where we are right
Hmm.
now, independent of the literalness of, obviously, it's no accident that it's showing up at a time in which, we're having conversations about Asian
Hmm.
Americans, and the spotlight has been much more shifted towards what that means, and the systemic racism that's comes in that community also, from, or towards that community. And then of course, instigated by the kind of racist talk that came from the last administration about the virus
Hmm.
and stuff like that. So anyway, I know that it's a great time for this movie to be here, for the sake of another conversation which allows Asian Americans to be platform and lifted up. But I'm still trying to. One of the things I do is I put America as the main character, and I say, what does this say if America is Jacob, Stephen Yeun's character?
Right.
What does it say about where we're headed, what we're dealing with? Maybe foreshadowing some of the themes of this coming year. And I just wanted to know, I didn't tell you this beforehand, so it's a lot to put you on the spot, because I haven't figured it out either. Is just, from your perspective, why this movie now? And is there anything that you see independent of sort of the literalness of an Asian American film more towards the, you know, the character himself and what is it saying
Mhm.
to us all. Any thoughts about that?
Um, so again, I'll set a disclaimer, having only seen the movie once, and I can't wait for it to come out to own because you know, I'm definitely going to add it to my collection. But having only seen it once, and really trying to um, battling my faulty memory too, right? So
Yeah,
I'm
of course.
just trying to remember the movie because it's been a minute since I've seen it. Um, but I think about storytelling in general, and the idea of what empathy is.
Mm.
And think about what empathy really is different from sympathy. Is sympathy is just feeling sorry for somebody. Empathy is really being in their shoes, like trying to understand and put themselves in a place that is outside of one's own body and
Mm.
mind. And storytelling is essential to empathy. It's really critical. If you don't understand a person's story, there's no hope that you will ever understand, you know, what they're feeling, what they've experienced, where they're coming from. And just to have the story out there, I think is a critical uh I mean it the movie is important just in that one aspect, right? Is that it tells that story. It tells that story that so many of us can relate to. My cousins, my brother, I mean, all of us, we can all relate to that story. So we don't often have an opportunity to tell our story,
Mm.
right? When I talk to my cousins, obviously we all know the story because we lived it. But outside of that, nobody ever asked me really how you grew up. What was it like being a Korean American in the States? Growing up in the 80s and 90s, nobody ever asked me that. So and I take it for granted, and I think it's one way to avoid um, the trap and the laziness of stereotyping people, right? Or lumping people into that one giant, you know,
Yeah.
umbrella that is Asian America, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think just in that aspect, um, the movie is worth the watch
Yeah,
just for that.
totally. I think that's so well said. Um, there's one theme that I wanted to see what you thought of. I'm kind of throwing spaghetti on the wall with this one, but I
Okay.
felt like that this theme actually does have to do with a lot of the other Oscar nominees. And so I wanted to get your perspective on this. And the theme is something around ownership, the idea of
Hmm.
feeling a sense of dignity in ownership. Um, you know, there's different movies where, like for instance, Nomadland, where she has a van and she feels a sense
Mm-hmm.
of dignity because she has this van that is her van where she's made her home. You know, um,
Right.
there's a sense of, you know, whether in Sound of Metal, whether the guy's going to own his, you know, his deafness as a sense of dignity, you know, or, you know, whether he's rejecting it. And in Minari, one of the things I feel like is very present is that sense of the father feeling like he's trying to get a sense of dignity as a man, as a husband, as a father, by his ownership of this land, you know,
Mm.
versus the chicken sexing, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
just feels like if he has this land, if he can make it grow, then he is a good father, he is a good husband, that kind of thing. And so there's something in this about the concept of ownership that provides dignity. And I don't know what you think of that from that standpoint, either from a Korean American standpoint or just from a,
Mm.
you know, like what does this have to do with America right now perspective?
Wow. Um, Well, I just think about the term, the idea of ownership, and in so many different ways, right? And you can think about the other Oscar nominees and apply ownership a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
There's the ownership in the sense of accountability, like, you know, owning up to whatever it is that you've done or didn't do, what have you. Um, but I think it's if you think about in Minari, it's the like one of the I know one of the happiest days I think for my parents was when they bought their house,
Mm.
right? So we came to the States and we just rented, right, for a long time. But when they were in a position to actually buy a house, I mean, that was a huge deal, right? Being a homeowner, and I know that's not just a Korean American thing. That's almost every American thing, right? It's when you buy your own home, it's a big deal. Um, and I think he's in the movie. Jacob is got, yeah, he's definitely hung up on the ownership. But I felt like what was more important about that is what he's able to do with that. It's not just about the land. It's not about the deed or the title. It's about what he can produce out of that land, and it's the fruit of his labor that I think is the more important aspect of the story to me, anyway. Because I think back to why it is that my parents came here, why it is that my aunts and uncles came here. Yeah, if things worked out, they would like the piece of the American dream, but they knew in all reality it was really going to be about for us, for me, my brother, my cousins, right? It's that second generation.
Yeah.
So for him, it's the fruit of what he owns,
Mm-hmm.
and the fruit of his labors, both on the land and in the farm, but also of his labors in general in the country, is really to see what kind of fruit it will bear for his children and not so much for himself.
So good.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think, I don't know if that answers your question, Brian, but that would have been my take on the concept of ownership, at least as it applied to Minari.
It's good. I love it, man. Well, very good. Well, thanks so much for all this time and being able to kind of break down from your perspective, both macro level as far as our country, but also micro level as far as your personal connection with the story. I think it helps, like you said. At the end of the day, I think, like you said, that where our ending point is that idea of empathy, which we've lost a lot of in our culture
Yeah.
these days, is the ability to put ourselves in another person's shoes. So I think what you said was perfect as far as just landing it on, if we can tell stories that allow us to them to be universal enough that we understand, but
Right.
specific enough that we can put ourselves in other people's shoes, to see their experience, and then for your experience to actually be on the screen for once, is just the beautiful aspect of this film. So that's why to see Minari, and among a lot of other things. But thanks for being on the show, and thanks for just lending your perspective on this movie. And when it comes out, then we'll have much more conversations, I'm sure, too.
Oh, for sure. And
When it comes out on DVD.
absolutely. And thanks, Brian, for the opportunity to share my story.
Yeah, no
I
doubt.
appreciate it very much and appreciate you. So
Likewise.
thank
Well,
you.
we'll see you next time on another episode of the Movie Whisperer, and we'll look at another Oscar nominee and see what it says about the intersection, or what we think it might say about the intersection of our story. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.